I'm Noah Waldeck from Subjectively Objective, and today I'm going to be reviewing Alec Soth's new book, Advice for Young Artists. So, the first thing you see looking at this book is this bright orange book cloth. You also see the title here that's foiled and embossed into the cloth with a white matte foil, and it runs off at this angle that's parallel with the trapezoidal shape of this frame drawing. Now, this drawing by Catherine Brockelman, one of Alec's former assistants, is actually of Alec himself. And talking about this book in interviews, Alec has said that he finds this title very disturbing because it's so presumptuous to have named it Advice for Young Artists. So the cracked portrait of himself is intended to offset that somewhat. However, in talking about it, he still finds the idea that he named it this pretty cringy. Here we have a nice pink end paper that I do feel like is a nice complement to the orange of the book cloth. And then right away here on the first page, we get something that's a recurrent theme in this book, and that's of these post-it notes. As you'll see as we go throughout the book, it's really just a photo book, and it's not really a book of advice like you might have assumed from the title. So the title is in a way intentionally misleading. Here, though, this first post-it note we get says, "Who is this book for?" Again, a lot of the purported advice that we're getting really seems to be more of Alec looking for advice himself, or kind of asking himself questions, than it is any advice he's giving to anyone else. I do like this first image quite a bit here. It's very subtle and minimal, but of a doorway that has no door in it is kind of a nice little metaphor here. This book is published by Mac, who actually, there's an interesting background between Mac and Alec Soth when it comes to books. So Michael Mac, who runs Mac, used to work for Steidl, who published many of Alec's earlier books like Sleeping by the Mississippi or Niagara. And those books had become quite rare and been out of print. And so to get a copy, it was very expensive to get a secondhand one because they were extremely collectible. Once Alec started working with Mac, I believe with Songbook, since then, Mac has reissued some of his early titles like Sleeping by the Mississippi and Niagara, and are now making them continually available. So you don't have to buy a super expensive secondhand copy to get Sleeping by the Mississippi. You can buy a brand new one from Mac anytime you like. And so that's actually kind of an interesting change and something that Mac has done to make Alec's work more accessible, to the general public. Here we get another thing that becomes a very recurrent theme throughout this book, that of Alec photographing still lifes. And this project came about as what he really did is he went to 25 different art schools or the art programs of colleges and universities. He kind of proposed them the idea of doing this as a trade between him and the department, that he would mentor some students in compensation for getting access to be able to photograph at their facilities. Interestingly, he said the actual art schools were the ones that were more difficult to photograph at, whereas even places like Harvard sometimes kind of let him run loose and do whatever he wanted. This here, I think, makes for a nice pair. I like the visual contrast between these two things palette-wise, but I also can see what Alec's obviously intentionally doing here is kind of riffing on this three-dimensional perspective, drawing on this chalkboard, and then this, the perspective shape of this raised rolling platform for still lifes. Alec said that he originally didn't set out to make this body of work about young artists. First, he was working on a project where he was looking for loners. That's what originally led him to stopping by an art school. And then from there, he was planning on photographing young and old artists, but then he decided that just focusing on the young artists was what drew him there, because again, this book seems like it was meant to be sort of a way to go back to his youth and kind of rediscover the process of experimenting and just kind of messing around with a camera like you might do in art school. I like this pair fairly well too. I'm intrigued by this image here of it's subtle, but it appears to be tripod marks or something like that, so you can put your tripod back in the same spot, or possibly easels or something. But they have different students' names marked out on them so they could go back to them again. Again, here, this seems to be a bit of a meta image of, again, looking at the audience like Alec himself would do if he was giving a lecture at one of these art schools. Here again, another little still life image of this mouse in a box. I like that as an image. Okay, and here we get another one of these post-it notes. Again, this recurrent theme. The idea of the post-it notes originally was meant to serve as like a placeholder where he'd come back in and give some really great advice. But instead, what he's done, we have these post-it notes that say things like patience, etc. Again, they seem like they're really more notes to Alec himself than they are, any concrete advice for us. As someone who went to art school myself, I actually feel like this still life here reminds me of something that I might have made messing around in the studio as someone who's not really interested in studio photography or still lifes. You're just kind of using these objects that are lying around to try to make something interesting. Here we get another pair that, again, I think works fine as a pair. This portrait is one of many in the book that I feel like don't rise to the same level that we're kind of used to expecting with Alec's portraiture, something that he's extremely well known for, particularly in his documentary work, making these portraits that are very poignant and feel like they have a lot of depth to them. Some of these portraits in this book, again, feel a little bit more looser or a little more tossed off. They don't feel like they have the same intensity of the portraits that he's known for in his documentary work. Again, here, this is another example of, again, I feel like a portrait that does, it has a little bit of a playfulness. Obviously, this book, I think, is intended somewhat humorously, but, it's also, again, kind of Alec looking back, trying to feel what it was like to be a young student again, or a young artist. This is something you notice in the book, that there are quite a few pairs here that have really similar palettes and seem to be the reason why they were paired together. Basically, they have light backgrounds, or they have more similar colored backgrounds, or, predominant color palettes of the images. And so they work fine. I would say I probably prefer the ones, though, that have a little bit more contrast between them. But again, I think this is definitely meant to be, this artist looks like he's having an amusing time himself. And then again, here we get this kind of playful study with the gels and the rulers that are all kind of clamped together in this haphazard way. Sequence-wise, this is one of the weaker parts of the sequence for me, of a book that I overall think is sequenced pretty well. Again, going from these really two similarly paletted spreads back to back feels a little bit samey to me. Something, though, I will note is, this is a really nice design point, is that the margins here, we have about 1.5 inches on the outside, and then if you put it in here, you see there's actually about 1/8 inch more, so it's like 1 5/8 inches. By doing this, even though there's actually more space from the gutter to the image than the image to the outside of the page, makes the book look like the images are all visually centered in this square book. Again, most of these are portrait-oriented images. There are some landscape-oriented ones, but they all feel like they're centered on the page, and that's because the designer included this extra space in the gutter to compensate for the fact that the book does not open perfectly flat. A lot of books don't do this, and you'll notice that it makes it feel like the images are getting sucked toward the gutter. Again, this is something I always do for my own books, and it's really nice to see it being done on another book here. Again, the print reproduction quality of this book is really nice. Again, Mac publishes really, really beautiful books. This is a little interesting story behind this image. One of Alec's former assistants, Cooper, who's a painter, invited him along on this shoot where Cooper was painting someone in their home. And so again, there's this kind of multi-layered thing of Alec having this relationship with a young artist. He actually met Cooper originally at something called the Winnebago workshop that he did, where he was taking high school students and giving them photography workshops, and they travel around into Winnebago on a little road trip to do the workshops. There's also a photograph of Cooper in A Pound of Pictures. I quite like this one as a pair. Again, I think that the visual contrast between these things, the very minimalist, kind of white on white on white of this, and then again, this more field of color here with these flowers, no doubt outside of one of the art schools that he was visiting. Here's a pair again that I feel like is really relying heavily on the palette similarities, which again, I don't feel like is quite as strong. I actually feel like this image on the right here probably would have been a little more impactful to me without the pairing. I think what he was attempting to kind of riff on here is that little sculptures, the entwined figures, and the kind of feeling here of this, which really feels like this looks like this young artist is holding a shutter release and is photographing Alec while he's photographing her, even though it's like Alec is the camera in this image. Again, here's a pair again that I also would say I enjoy. The contrast between the chaos of this written whiteboard here and then this constructed still life that Alec made. I believe all of the still lifes in this book are ones that Alec constructed himself using the materials that were available at the school. You see here Alec popping into the image himself in the background is kind of becoming part of his own still life. And you actually see that happening again here. Alec is partially visible in the mirror, partially obscured with the flash. Interesting that he chose to put those two back to back. I don't know that I would have done that. And then here we get the photograph that serves as the cover image. I actually think it works a little more strongly on the cover itself. Here it feels more of just a document of the thing, where when it's actually cut out, I feel like it's a little more impactful. Whereas this photograph really seems just to serve to show you the cracked drawing itself. Interesting thing to note about this project as well is that Alec was shooting digitally with a Fuji GFX, and he says whenever he talks about it in the lectures he's given since he's put out this project, as soon as he mentions the book is shot digitally, he can feel the audience deflating, which he said he understands. He knows the enthusiasm people have for film, and again, he's mostly known for working with large format film. And he actually said that he started the project while shooting on film, but he felt that it was a little bit too warm, a little bit too sentimental feeling almost. And he also liked shooting digitally, allowed him to feel kind of like out of his comfort zone and being back a little bit more like being a young student himself. This one right here is actually my very favorite pair in the book. I really like the visual contrast between these two things. This portrait, I think, is one of the few in here that I do feel like has the same type of power as the portraits that Alec is known for. And I really like how this student's closed eyes and this kind of ray drawing here on the chalkboard, it reminds me of closing your eyes and looking up towards the sun and like feeling the light coming through your eyelids. Again, I feel like this one works really strongly. It's very evocative. This one, you have a printout that's being used as probably a one-to-one study here in order to do a painting off of this photograph, and you can see how the artist has been using and making tone samples for the skin tones and things like that of these wrestlers intertwined. And then you have this it looks like people are painting a still life, but then again, you actually see that it's actually a photograph that they're painting from. So kind of an interesting detail there. Here on this page, you have a little bit of a female anatomy study that you won't be able to see in this book since it's not something you can show on YouTube. Again, contrasted here with this kind of strange hairless dog or some type of creature that again are meant to be studies for painting. So again, it feels like there's meant to be a little bit of a cheeky, humorous element to the way he's using it here. Again, we have another one pair that has a nice visual contrast between it. As a still life, it's a pretty subtle one. Again, I don't think the portrait is necessarily as strong as some of his strongest portraits, but again, it's still a nice pair. And again, the sequencing of this book is pretty fluid seeming. As you move through it, it really does. You don't really question many of the sequencing choices. It all feels very natural. You don't necessarily expect what's coming next, even though things are still sequenced in a way where the work in the book is all fairly similar looking, that is. This is an interesting one. It's more of a found still life of these blossoms on these large rocks with the moss or the lichen. And then here he's paired it with one of the post-it notes that says, accept yourself, with little musical notes as if it's a song about accepting yourself. Something to note about these post-it notes too, I can't say this for sure, but I would not be surprised if they actually used an additional spot color or several additional spot colors in addition to the 4-color CMYK offset process in order to get these very electric looking post-it notes, because those would be something that would usually be quite difficult to reproduce in just the 4-color process. This a figure from behind here is definitely a recurrent theme in Alec's work. He actually, in one of his lists that he often tapes to his steering wheels while he's out photographing projects, driving around, of things that he's looking for. I believe maybe one of them in possibly A Pound of Pictures, that list references figures from behind as something he's looking for. So again, that's kind of a theme in his work. I do like how the color palette's working with this one, with the contrast between the pink hair and the pink wall, and even that purple lava lamp back there. This again, I think, is one of the stronger pairs in the book. I do like the contrast between things. I particularly like this one as an image, the way the flash is working with this foliage. That's something that I'm interested in personally, but seeing this list, that someone else has put together about these kind of rules about making artwork, and then this young artist here separated between the canvases with this kind of pensive look on his face, but even the detail of the band-aid on his head is really interesting, how that sets it off. Again, another one here that feels like it's really meant to show the humor of what Alec is trying to do here. Here, the post-it note of supposed advice is something about less being more. Again, that's pretty vague. But then we have this image where, again, it's this, totally, again, white on white on white color palette. So definitely a minimalist, less is more type image. And so he's kind of pairing that with his advice again in a way that seems like it's meant to be a little bit humorous. Interesting thing to note too about his process of shooting digitally is that he said that in an interview that he, for this project, kind of discovered focus stacking for the first time, and was something that he played around and messed around with, particularly using it for the still lifes, which again, he said was a little bit embarrassing to admit, because again, that's a widely known, digital technique, but not something that he was comfortable with. And he equated it to being when you're first a student, experimenting with darkroom chemistry and things like that. So really overall, it seems like this book is an attempt by Alec to reconnect with that time in his youth when he felt young and experimental. Here again, we have another one where Alec is definitely thinking about the idea of, aging. Here you have this sculpture of what it looks like to be an older figure with these kind of gaunt, sunken cheeks. And then we have Alec looking like he's almost accidentally part of the frame, but obviously there's meant to be kind of a contrast there between that. You also have this mirror here that's so dirty that you couldn't even see yourself in it paired with it. Again, there is a nice visual contrast between this. I quite like this as a pair. This, I think, is another nice pair. One of the few that includes two figures in it, and also something that just kind of I guess, reminds me very much of the environment of being at art school, or even now as a teacher at an art school. Kind of reminds me of a story that just happened to me the other day, where a couple of students asked me to help them move 500 pounds of sand out of the basement studio that they brought down in bags, and then needed to figure out a way to get it out since it was all loose sand now. This here, I think, is one of the nicest portraits in the entire book. Again, it feels very much like a classic Alec Soth documentary style portrait. I really like the way the flash and the leaves are working, but also, again, the intensity of the look and gaze on the figure is one of those portraits that really kind of allows you as the viewer to project something onto it, but the photograph is bringing a certain amount of intensity from the viewer. Again, I think it's a very good choice to have let this one be a single so it could really have that power on its own. Again, we have another one of the post-it notes. What do you really want, really? And then we have it paired here with this some type of taxidermied big cat here, looking like it's jumping, as something to be used for drawing as a still life. It's interesting. Alex talks about his work being a spectrum between his documentary work on one side, and then on the other side, a sort of narcissistic, inward looking expressionism. And he says that this book is definitely on that more narcissistic side of the spectrum. Hence, even what he was going for with the more cringy cover. But again, I actually think that's a pretty good, fair assessment of his work as a whole in this project. This definitely feels like something, that only an established artist who's already made significant work that's got them well established would attempt doing. This kind of going back to your youth. Again, it's definitely a subtler, again, less serious, a little more cheeky book than, again, the classic works that he's known for. So I can definitely see the assessment of it being a little bit more inward looking, or even, as Alex said, narcissistic to make a project like this. This pair here, we see this almost kind of Pollock-esque splatter painting, but not an intentional painting, really just all the paint marks on the ground from all the paint that's been dropped in the studio over time. And here we have it paired with this empty chair for figure drawing. And then over here, which like I said, is going to be partially blurred out on YouTube, but we have, again, the figure drawing model there standing, which I'm guessing is probably Alec himself. It's probably a bit of a callback to a similar image that he included in Niagara, which, if you've seen that book, you'll know what I'm talking about. Here we have another nice pair. Again, this one is definitely playing on the similarities between the colors of these post-it notes and here. But again, I really do quite like this as a portrait and as a subtle pair. And here we have what definitely functions more like a diptych. I do think this is something that definitely, again, is a reoccurrent theme in many of Soth's books, where you have two images that are not necessarily meant to be just a pure diptych of two things that are the same scene cut in half, but you have two slightly different views of it, but they really do feel connected. This one here, the way the flash is shaping the forms of all these sculptures, definitely feels like it's more like, a detail of this sculpture that's been made. But this frame really makes it about the comparison between the sculptures themselves and then the sculptural qualities of the brick wall, the power outlet, the pipes, and so the contrast there. I think this one works pretty well, again, as that type of diptych of the same subject matter. Here, another one, again, that definitely seems like it's meant to be a little bit humorous, again, and even kind of riffing on the idea that this is not really a book of advice. This post-it note says everything I know, as if that's what he was planning on sharing with you. And then we have this pile of books here against a wall. which is definitely feels like, again, a callback to some of his earlier work. He's always been interested in books lying on the ground, piles of books. There was even an installation of a pile of books to go along with his book Broken Manual at the exhibition. And again, he said that this book really is kind of more on the side of Broken Manual, which was his first real departure from his classic style of documentary work that he made. And so he feels like he's kind of returning to that style with this book. But I think, again, this one gives you a little chuckle, the idea of everything I know in this kind of sad little pile of books. And then here you actually get this interview, or self-interview as he calls it, that's included with the work. I'm actually going to go ahead and read this, even though it's not super long, but I actually feel like this sheds a lot of light on the idea of what Alec was trying to do with this book. It says, "The title of your book suggests you'll pass along some wisdom. Why are there only pictures? When I began my career as a photographer, I was surprised to learn how much talking was involved. Along with interviews like this, I've given a lot of lectures, usually at colleges. During the Q&A, students often ask me for advice. I want this book to serve as a non-verbal response. So why are you doing this interview? Because it's a fantasy that art lives in a wordless vacuum. Talking is a way for me to figure out which words to attach to this work. What sort of advice do you give those students during a Q&A? I'm reminded of an interview with Margaret Atwood in which she gives the predictable advice of writing every day. When confronted with the fact that Atwood herself doesn't write daily, she says, "I don't, but you should." Advice is so tied to one's own experience that it feels presumptuous to think it's applicable to others. I worry it might also be dispiriting. I often encourage patience, but how helpful is that to someone who's chomping at the bit? In the most famous book of creative advice, Letters to a Young Poet, Rilke begs the young poet to be patient. But Rilke was only 27 when he wrote this. Do you ever give specific advice? I often recommend making maquettes to physically visualize one's dream of exhibiting or publishing. For photobooks, I sometimes say that they should only have as many pictures as the photographer's age. How old are you? 54. Age seems to be a big theme in your recent work. I've always been hyper-aware of age. When I was turning 40, I learned that the average age in which artists produce their most significant work is usually between 28 and 38. I wrote a blog post about this that angered a lot of people, which I understand. If you are a 50-year-old mother who is finally able to focus on her own work, this generalized statistical analysis is just another roadblock. It's also annoying to younger artists who feel pressured to get their foot in the door. You've been photographing young artists. How did you meet them? Shortly before beginning this book, I became fascinated with the late work of Walker Evans. His best-known pictures were made when he was young. In middle age, his work petered out. But near the end of his life, there was a burst of energy when Evans discovered the Polaroid camera. The most reproduced Polaroids look like classic Evans, old signs and such. But the work I love are his portraits of young people made while visiting universities. Despite his skepticism that art could be taught, Evans found his time with students invigorating. There's something almost vampiric about his Polaroids, like he was feeding off their youth. I'm not Walker Evans, and I'm hopefully not at the end of my life, but looking at those Polaroids sparked something. So I started inviting myself to undergrad art programs. They didn't invite you? Usually not. My idea was to approach the schools as a kind of trade. In exchange for access, I'd meet with classes or individual students, but I didn't want to give lectures or act like an expert. I liked just hanging around and pretending I was an art student. And then crossed out he has, maybe this project was an attempt to feel young again. How old were you when you fell in love with art? 16. I even remember the moment. I'd been given homework by my art teacher. Alone in my bedroom, I drew while I listened to Hatful of Hollow, an album by the Smiths. The music and the sketchpad sort of merged with my imagination. It felt like a whole universe opened. How would you describe that universe? Like outer space, lonely, but in a good way. As an extremely shy kid, I spent a lot of time playing alone. I would build forts and I had an entire cast of pretend friends. The solitary playfulness evaporated with adolescence, but it returned that night drawing in my bedroom. Loneliness became a resource. I felt like I'd struck oil. Did this give you ambition to become an artist? I went to college thinking I was going to be the next great expressionist painter, but my loneliness in college became overwhelming. I didn't have a single friend. While loneliness might have been useful creatively, it was otherwise debilitating. I kept making art, but I couldn't imagine surviving in the art world. What advice would you give that kid now? Accept yourself. This is also the name of a song on Hatful of Hollow, but advice like that sounds a lot better embedded in music. Again, that was a little bit of a long thing to read, but the reason I wanted to do it is because I do feel like that shed a lot of light on what Alec was doing in the process of creating this book. It's interesting how he references the older Walker Evans and how that was something that he felt inspired by, how Walker Evans was almost feeding off the youth of others. And again, I wouldn't say that what Alec Soth is doing here is vampiric, like he said about Evans, but I can definitely see the idea of wanting to connect with students and feeling inspired by that. That's definitely something as a teacher, being around students definitely makes me feel more inspired about the own work I'm making, whether it's my own photographs or, assembling books and publishing them, things like that. I definitely, there is a certain energy amongst young artists that as someone who's not so young anymore, you do feel like you're able to glean. It's also interesting about the idea of the advice that he's given and whether it's advice he follows, very much like what he's talking about with Margaret Atwood, the advice of writing every day, where she says, I don't, but you should. Here in this image, we actually do see Alec following his own advice. This is actually the last image in the book, and so it's kind of this meta closer. This is a little diorama of an exhibition of the very work that's in this book, that he's made these little printouts. He built these fake little gallery walls. Again, so he's looking at what would be like to exhibit this work, which is, again, part of the advice he gives. But then he also gives the advice about making physical maquettes of books. And he's actually talked recently about how he usually makes PDFs instead of physical maquettes now, because he feels like it's a simpler way and it still helps him with the pairing and the sequencing of the book, which is really an interesting thing, because that's actually the way I also put together books, is all digitally, looking at the PDFs of them. Don't feel it necessary to make physical maquettes of books. So I actually relate to that part of what Alec is doing in practice, even though that's not the advice he's giving. Also, something to note, we've passed it now, but this book actually is mainly, I would say, pairs with just some singles, whereas most of his books rely more heavily on singles than pairs. But this book is a little bit of an outlier in that regard. Here again, we have thank yous of the 25 art schools he visited, the young artists he photographed, and then everyone else who helped. And then we close out with one final post-it note: make me young, make me young, make me young. Kurt Vonnegut, The Breakfast of Champions. So again, now the question is this a book that you should buy? Alec Soth has published at least 3 books that I would consider to be modern photo book classics: Sleeping by the Mississippi, Niagara, and Songbook. Again, other people may find some of his other books classic, but I would say those 3 are pretty widely accepted as classic books. I feel like his last book before this, A Pound of Pictures, was really kind of a return to form, to his more classic style after his previous book before that, I Know How Furiously Your Heart is beating, which has some great images in it, but it's extremely loose and it doesn't necessarily feel particularly cohesive as a book. So this book, again, is definitely not the classic Soth documentary style that you've come to expect from him potentially. It's definitely a more self-indulgent work, again, of an established artist, as Soth himself said, maybe on the more narcissistic side of his, his process. So if you're new to Soth's work and you don't have any of his other books, I would say go buy a copy of Sleeping by the Mississippi or Songbook, which are really great, powerful books filled with, tons of really classic killer images. This book feels like it's going to be more resonant if you're someone who's had experience going to art school or being around that type of community and kind of relate to the feeling of being a young artist, or again, being someone who's older, interacting with young artists. Again, then it might appeal to you. But if you only, are looking for something that's more of what Soth is known for, you might find this book a little more uninteresting or boring compared to how really strong some of his other books are. So again, I think it's a little bit of a mixed recommendation there. It's going to depend where you're coming from, whether you find this interesting or not. It is a very beautifully made book. Again, it has a nice sequencing to it. The book is $50 or $55 if you want to buy a signed copy from Mac. So not a bad value. It's not a super large book, but it's not a small one either. So again, I feel like you're getting your money's worth if it's the type of book that would interest you. I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you did, please like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you'd really like to support what I'm doing, go to Subjectively Objective's website, find a book or magazine you'd enjoy, and buy it. And I'll be seeing you again soon.